Did you know that some school districts in the United States have students who speak over 100 different languages? As school psychologists strive to provide the best possible help to their students, what is a cultural stance that one can take to embrace the needs of all students, regardless of their language background? One school psychologist is doing just that. Dr. Reyna imbues her work with a value system of generosity and human interconnectedness that was passed down to her from her ancestors, the Choctaw people. In this enriching conversation, Dr. Reyna shares her journey and insights on how we can all work to create more inclusive and equitable schools. Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Zen. With more than 20 years of experience working in K-12 public schools, Dr. Reyna is a school psychologist and a nationally certified school psychologist. Dr. Reyna is multicultural, indigenous, part of two tribes, Choctaw and Purepecha, Mexican descent, and British-Irish descent. Dr. Reyna is contracted at a large urban school district in Houston, Texas, and teaches at the University of Houston Counseling Psychology Department. She published an article in 2017 titled Culturally Responsive School Psychology Practice, a study of practitioners' self-reported skill in contemporary school psychology. It is cited in a guide for culturally and linguistically diverse learners in Northern Ireland. It is also cited by other researchers in school psychology in the United States. Dr. Reyna, thank you very much for joining me today.
Good afternoon, Dr. Sen. Thank you for having me.
I am really curious about your journey in school psychology. Can you tell me, walk us through how you come to get into this work?
I didn't start off to become a school psychologist when I was in my undergrad, but I actually shouldn't be as nervous about doing my first podcast as I am today because I worked on radio at the time. I was
You
a
did?
radio broadcaster. Yeah, I don't think I mentioned that when we were preparing. So what happened was a lot was happening in that field at the time where, electronics and technology were changing the landscape of that field. It was really a hard, challenging time to make a living doing that work. So I inadvertently got into working in the medical field. And when doing that and encountering people who had disabilities, I got very interested in going back and to get a master's in psychology. And because I had such a positive experience as a child growing up in schools myself, that I decided school psychology would be a specialty area that I pursued.
You mentioned the positive experience in schools and also the intersectionality of your racial ethnic identity. Can you share with me what that was like going through the school system?
Experiences were not all positive
Okay.
because I did grow up in a community that was primarily Black and white. And when you are brown and at the time, Mexican descent and indigenous, you don't have a large community to surround you. And my father died when I was 8 years old and I was in third grade. And I saw, like within my own family, my mom's side, which was more the British, Irish, pretty much that's it. All of their family line is from the United Kingdom. And then my grandmother, who was from Mexico and came here as a child, them approaching that family crisis and that death of my father as, in different ways, how they were culturally taught to do so was interesting for me. So I became very aware of cultural differences at that time. But even before that, my father was a person of color who had a business in the city, and he was very sensitive. At the time, I was born in the 1960s, and the civil rights era was really in full swing at the time. And my father was someone who hired persons of color for his work, primarily for his business. And I was just always very comfortable, always very aware that I was a person of mixed color, if you will. Some of that I tried to work out, with my family's help. But my father was very proud of our heritage, and I kind of, like him, followed suit. My grandmother, on the other hand, was one who wanted to really just kind of fit in and completely acculturate and immerse. And she, for the most part, was able to do that in her adult years. But she, compared to the kind of experience I had growing up in public schools, was very different when she came. She was very much discriminated against, not allowed to use restrooms, water fountains, just like the blacks in America. She was treated the same way. And whenever I come in the 1970s, start school in first grade, the very beginning of the 1970s, I didn't have to deal with that. The only thing that I really had to deal with that with people just kind of not understanding, where are you from? You would get that a lot. Where are you from? What nationality are you? Is how they would usually say it. The only thing that I really knew at the time that might have made me look different from the typical black and white population around me was that my grandmother was from Mexico. Because I was very dark skinned, small in stature, and those kinds of things. I have like dark hair naturally, and so I did look a little different. My mother said, because she was very fair and white and blonde hair and blue eyed, that when she took me to like grocery stores in the community, they thought she was babysitting me. They didn't think that, I was her child because I looked different.
Ooh, that must have been really tough for you and your mom.
I don't remember that as much as my mom. She talked about it a lot and for a lot of
Mm,
years, actually. So, yeah, but I favor her in terms of my features.
yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, just when people just looking at color, there was like a stark difference between our color. I was more taken after my dad's side.
So, in terms of school psychology, how did you get into that specifically?
I was in my 20s, undergrad, wanting to do something to give back, if you will. That was kind of my thing. I want to give back to a system that helped me to achieve and help me. Education's always been important to me, kind of in me to want to give and give back. And I didn't look for a profession that I would make a lot of money, which is different than people who were teens and in college in the 80s, like I was. That was when Wall Street was really big, but I wasn't interested in prosperity. I was interested in a vocation that really helped me to give back to the community.
And thinking about this podcast, People of Color in Psychology, and our listeners, what is something you like them to know?
Well, you mentioned my Choctaw heritage, and I think I sent you a picture of that beautiful bowl that sits in Cork, Ireland. And I am both of Choctaw and Irish descent. Well, back during the potato famine, the Choctaw, who are a very humble tribe in the southeastern region of the United States, specifically, my forebears come from Alabama, and they really felt a lot of empathy for the Irish way across the big blue pond who were suffering from starvation and gathered up money during the 19th century to feed them, to send to them and to feed them and to keep them going on. And so there was a large statue that's shaped like its feathers in a bowl. And it lights up and it's very vivid with all the colors that feathers might possess. That's a tribute to the Choctaw Nation for helping them through that huge hunger crisis in Ireland. And actually, during the pandemic, the Irish turned around and sent a lot of and did the same thing. They sent money to the Navajo Nation, who was suffering a great deal during the pandemic. That they were suffering in terms of their numbers also were being affected by COVID. There was poor medical care, loss of income, etc. Food was scarce. And so they kind of reciprocated in that vein to share to Native Americans that were going through this tough time as well. So I think the Choctaw's nature of doing that very much, I have that in me, even if I don't know a lot of it because so many of my forebears have passed. Like to prepare for this, I didn't have a lot of elders to reach out to. When I was a child, I had access to some of those elders. I just feel that what little I have, I want to give. I mean, I'm not trying to toot my own horn. I'm here to share whatever I have. And I definitely think that's something that is true to all indigenous nations in the United States. My colonial ancestors would not have been able to survive had the indigenous people not shared their knowledge of agriculture and medicine and helped them to settle in and to survive because there were attempts to settle in America before the successful, we hear about, the Plymouth landing. There were lots of attempts before that. And the coast in which, the first colonists came was harsh in the wintertime. And so, I mean, it's just kind of me to give what little I have. It feels good to give. It feels unnatural not to give.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, so really showing respect and acknowledgement of your heritage, of your ancestors. And
Mhm.
it's actually quite amazing that I'm wondering, wait, how did they even hear about the Irish
You
back
know,
then?
I've wondered that myself. How did that information get through? And certainly when things traveled by pony or, Pony Express, the ponies didn't go to Ireland. I've often wondered how that occurred as well. I'm guessing maybe word of mouth because there was still a big influx of people from the United Kingdom coming to the United States. And they must have found out, well, they're coming here because, in their land, they're not able to eat. There's a lot of hunger. So they're coming here to survive, basically. And there was a lot of compassion and empathy for them.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. And of course, for our listeners, I'm definitely going to include that photo that you're describing so they can see the feathers, the sculpture. Is it a sculpture? What
It
is it?
is,
A
yes,
sculpture. Yeah.
it's a large sculpture. And I hope to go there. That's on my bucket list to go there and to see that firsthand. I have traveled to the UK before, but not to Cork, Ireland. So I hope to do that.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing that history. And what else would you like to share with our listeners?
Well, I think also being of more than one significant cultural heritage and heritage that you respect and admire and want to definitely feel and see that as part of your identity. We're kind of still in a place in our country where another thing that struck me as a young person even into adulthood was when we fill out applications for what our passport, our driver's license, our employment opportunities, we identify what race and ethnicity that we have. And I am part white, but I didn't want to like just say white and not put the other things. And they would often have in the past, I think in the 1990s in particular, white, not Hispanic. And I hated that. I hated to have to choose white, not Hispanic, because I'm both white and Hispanic. I'm white and indigenous. And now it's establishments who are truly trying to find out where we are, including the Census Bureau, will ask you, are you people in the home part of Hispanic heritage, part of Native American heritage? And you can choose all that apply. So that's really exciting that you can do that now. But there was a time when we were forced choice in
Hmm.
terms of which one. And very often we were forced to choose what was in the eye of the beholder, not what was a part of our own self identity. And what I like about where we are now, our self identity is valued and not what someone outside of ourselves perceives us to be.
Yeah.
We still have people who will criticize. All of us are cultural beings, and there's more to us than what is available at face value.
Yeah. To be able to self identify, I did see that with the recent change in the census, the ability
Mhm,
to check different racial categories and ethnic
mhm.
categories. Yeah. Now, tell me about your work in school psychology. And because prior to the recording, you shared some pretty interesting stats about the composition. How I think previously it was mostly uh, school psychologists have been primarily white and female, and then now it's beginning to diversify. Can you share with us
Sure,
just some your experience because you've been able to see the growth of the profession?
sure. Well, when I did my dissertation research, candidacy first and then dissertation research, there had not been a lot of change in school psychology from 1980, where it was still predominantly women and predominantly white women. All the other ethnic groups were less than 10%. In fact, I had to collapse all mine into an aggregate to run some of my statistics because they were too small compared to the other size of the ethnic group, because I did do some analysis based on the different groups. And I looked at recent data that's come out of the National Association of School Psychologists, and we're more represented ethnically, and there's been more gender representation too, where more males are in the profession now than previously. The Hispanic and Latinx population that works in school psychology are a little above 10%, which is good. However, other groups are still very low. Asian groups are low, indigenous, very, very low. African American groups is between 6 and 7% because it changed from 10 years ago when I finished my dissertation to now. So what will the next 10 years look like? Just by, anecdotally seeing in the United States that more representativeness is coming into the profession of school psychology in particular.
Do you have any sort of hunch as to what's helped facilitate that growth?
It's research. It's people taking a chance at doing research. I will tell you, whenever I started looking at cultural research, I had a wonderful, supportive advisor who was like that. And I was talking, and there were very few people at the time that were researchers. Researchers like Dr. Antoinette Miranda, who's had a lot of influence on my work, even though I've never met her. There's a lot more out there about cultural competency and cultural awareness. Also, the National Association of School Psychologists has a awareness week every fall of each year. And they have been really influencing those of us who are members of the profession and of the organization to go to like high schools and talk to students, because most people, including myself, we graduated with one degree. We didn't know what a school psychologist was. And so a lot of us, are going into undergrad college, programs and into high school psychology programs and letting students know about this particular profession within psychology.
Mm.
And there's a critical shortage right now in the state of Texas and nationally, but in particular in the growing state of Texas, that we have more students than school psychologists to go around. And so we do a lot of things, preventive things, intervention, assessment. We get to do, it's a very exciting field to me because I like doing all those things. I like doing this assessment. I like doing consultation. I like doing counseling. I like doing, kinds of interventions, even the crisis, not that I enjoy crisis interventions, but those are good skills to have. And, I think a lot of people get into a field where they may be pigeonholed. Well, you're definitely not that way in school psychology. And if you also have a social justice sort of feeling within you, which I do, it's very exciting to be a part of that because you can be very future focused in helping students who come from a lot of disadvantage in our public schools. Many economically disadvantaged students are in our public schools. Families are less intact than they were centuries ago. So you have a lot of single parent homes with, working parents, and schools are a big part of a student's life. And they build relationships like I did, lasting relationships that, help them to feel safe in the world and supported. Actually, I didn't mention this to you, but I was honored in, I believe, 2017 by my high school for being a notable distinguished alumnus for having a PhD. Parents are passed away, and my aunts, I have a few aunts that are living, but were not healthy enough to attend with me. I chose because they were important people in my life. I had my second grade teacher there. I had some teachers from high school and leaders and things that I was a part of in terms of extracurricular activities to stand with. They are like surrogate parents at times, or at least that support system that children have. And I love being a part of that support system. Again, giving back and being in that system available to students who may need that support.
Yeah, it sounds like being a school psychologist and the work that you've done been able to have a high and direct impact with the students, directly work with them to do the assessments, to do the therapy work. Now, what might be a distinction between a school counselor versus a school psychologist? I think it's a
Yes.
common question.
Yeah, a lot of times I think people hear the word school before the word psychologist, and they get a vision of a guidance counselor sitting behind a desk creating schedules and trying to help someone decide what colleges they may be choosing in their future. And we're very different. We're actually work with disability conditions, child psychopathology, if you will, crises such as suicidality, crises such as a school-wide crisis like what we see in the news, being a part of the recovery process of those, addressing people who've been affected to a level beyond the crises. So, yeah, sometimes I think that gets frustrating for most of us that when people hear school, you can't even finish, I'm a school psychologist, that they're thinking of a school counselor. And no offense to school counselors, their job is very valuable, but they're usually more former teachers that kind of have administrative role on the campus. School psychologists are most often itinerant professionals who have a few schools and sometimes several schools that they support, that they get referred for evaluation of students who might qualify for disability conditions under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, IDEA.
Yeah. And so for folks who are curious about school psychology as a profession or licensed school psychologists, what are some tips you might provide for them in working with students of color? What are some nuances that you think you might be able to share with them to just pay attention to?
It's really important to have that compassion and empathy for persons who come from, different cultural backgrounds. For instance, I working in a large district that I work in, there are more than 100 languages represented. And most of us that are represent the profession are not multilingual. Some are bilingual, but not multilingual, certainly not with 100 languages. And so it's very important to know that language is a big part of what brings people together and what helps to build those relationships. But it's not impossible to do so even if you don't share the other language of the child and the family. We have interpreters that can come in and help sit with us in our interactions and our even, some aspects of the assessment, like interviews, for instance, that we can do with the help of interpreters. That, sometimes people are coming in and they have a lot of stress related to acculturation, or they may be doing something different. For instance, there's some family systems that aren't necessarily going to send just one person. Like, let's say the ethnocentric view would be that one person goes and represents the family and makes decisions based on the family. Well, very often collectivistic cultures like the African American culture, Latinx cultures, and Asian cultures, it's a group collective decision where there's a big support system. And if that group wants to come in and be of a support to the person who ultimately has to make the decision and sign the documents and decide what's going to happen for their child, then, be open to that and be understanding that that's just a different way that it's processed and decided upon, and it's actually a good thing. And I know that in school psychology and in education in particular, there is a lot of effort to try to accommodate those differences. And in fact, legally, we have to accommodate like a language difference. But the more represented education is by people who share ethnic differences or, beyond the classic American norm, what we can do is become multicultural competent. That's a choice we can have. Recognize we are all cultural beings, and there's more than one way to address a need. There's more than one way to address a circumstance, a crisis, decision-making process, and just be open to that.
Yeah, really being open to what the family is bringing in as well as the child in terms of their experience. And it makes sense that if you're involving the family, that the child is more likely to be successful in receiving the continued intervention that happens at school as well as at home. Really thinking about the support system that they're getting. Yeah.
Exactly. And I make a lot of effort to engage as frequently and as often as I can. For instance, at the beginning, in the system that I work in, if we're going to do a psychological evaluation for the full evaluation process, it is required that the school psychologist sits down with the parent and obtains consent. And then, we can get informed consent and they understand, because in times past, that person wouldn't do it. And by the time the evaluation process might be over, parents sometimes were not aware that a psychological was actually done on their child during this. It's just a sensitive thing to do, to establish a relationship and to maintain that relationship, so that the first time they see you or hear from you is not when they're getting the news of what your a psychological evaluation says, because it might be some devastating news. Some of the hardest evaluations that I have done, where I've seen the hardest for parents to process, or when we do identify autism and intellectual disability, for instance. Those are some really big, serious conditions, disability conditions that are going to have impact on that individual's life beyond school. So we need to be sensitive to that because very often that will start a grieving process in the family. What's going to happen? I've even had a parent who moved from school to school to school to school because they wouldn't let her daughter who had Fragile X get identified as ID. She would move when they would get close to that. And there was a time we sat down, just the two of us, so that she didn't have to sit down in front of the whole group of administrators, teachers, and have this sensitive discussion. So what is hard about this? You know, I know it's hard and I'm understanding. And I actually touched her hand gently and she said, what's going to happen when I die? And she was a woman young in her 30s. I was a woman young in my 30s, but I understood. And that was the first time she was able to let us or anybody, any school district, because she had been to several, make that determination on her child to program for that condition because the child was now 9 years old and she had moved since pre-K to try to not get that label, if you will, put on the
Mhm.
child because it was so devastating. And it wasn't just perhaps stigma related to that. There had to be some of that in there too, but it was the fear of once I sit down and have to take, this in and recognize intellectual disability as part of my daughter's life, what's going to happen when I'm gone because no one else is going to take care of her the way I'm taking care of her. And so we need to be sensitive to that too, that there's a grief process that starts, have to identify and determine some of these
Yeah.
serious
Once
conditions.
they're identified, it starts
Mhm.
that grief process. And there's so many things that the school psychology profession involves that we just don't talk about, or folks who are outside the school system aren't really aware. And so I'm glad that we are highlighting some of the contributions that school psychologists are doing. And like you're saying, yeah, a lot of students, peers during school, most of the day, that's a big chunk
Mhm.
of their life. So I do think it's important for us to have some familiarity with this.
And
Well,
that's an advantage of the profession too, if I can say. I mean, we don't have to wait for somebody to come to a clinic to see us. We've got a captive audience, if you will. We just show up at their school. We find out if they're in attendance. Sometimes truancy is an issue, especially with a high school, which I have a high school. But we get to show up where they're at and seriously to see them in their natural environment where it's real important because for adults usually the job is where you might have functional impairment or the social life, where the school is like the job for a child or and a teenager and an adolescent, is that's where they've got the most demands that they need to function well. And so we're there in that system where they're being tested literally and in every other way. They're having to maintain a lot of responsibility in their academic functioning as well as their social functioning. And very often that's where a lot of the problems lie so that we can reach them in the system they're in,
Mhm,
which
mhm.
is nice.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Dr. Reyna, thank you very much for all the work that you do. Do you have a final thought?
We need more school psychologists, and I am gung ho, as you can see. I think it's a wonderful profession. It's wonderful for me. There's never a dull moment. You can go in and have your day planned, and it may turn upside down and be very, very different, but that's kind of exciting. I like to be on the go. I like change and things like that. And so for me, it's something I'm a highly energetic person. It's a highly energetic environment and it's a good fit. And I can't say enough about how rewarding it is as a profession. And I hope that more people consider coming into the profession and supporting our future because these individuals that we work with in the future will be our leaders.
Yeah. Actually, just thinking back, I forgot to ask this question, and that is, as a person of color, what were some of the challenges that you faced and overcame that you would be willing to share?
I think that there's a lot of data out there that suggests that, if you will, white students have more privilege in systems, especially institutions like higher education, than persons of color. And exceptions are often made for people who experience white privilege. That's not the case for persons of color. I saw that in my graduate experience, not at the master's level, but I did at the doctoral level. And I've seen it in the profession as well in a APA internship site where, for instance, good example, one of the training director at the time was harder on all of us people of color. And he was harder on us literally in the dissertation defense process. He was harder on us as we were writing our dissertation document. We experienced a lot more criticism. That was hard. Perhaps hazing. That was hard. And it was hard to overcome it. I'll be honest, there are times when I think back of those moments, I still feel hurt, very, very hurt. But what I had to do in each and every situation, I had a support system at home, thankfully, and my husband. But I also had to sometimes just realize that if I said too much or made too many waves, it might be worse for me than if I endured something. And that's hard. Now, I think in some ways I called on my ancestors, and I'm not trying to be cheeky saying this, but all of my ancestors pretty much had to struggle to survive, including the Irish, as we've already mentioned. And I had a lot of perseverance, and I had to grow up with perseverance, having lost a father at a young age who was the family, the leader of the family, the breadwinner. I definitely had to overcome that process with perseverance and endure some of those harmful experiences with perseverance. I see a difference where I'm teaching now than what I experienced. For instance, it's safer, less competitive environment than it was when I was there. So I'm happy for the students that are there now, but competitive types of nature was set up sometimes by the leadership in my program in particular. And there was a lot of favoritism. Mm. And so that was hurtful and harmful. And sometimes that's just difficult to endure. But I have a lot of Black friends, and one told me that their parents were just realistic with them about, systems are going to be unfair to you. You have to try extra hard and work extra hard to overcome some of that. And just being aware so that you're not so surprised and shocked when those things happen. It's sad that we have to be aware of that possibility of human nature that's going to create obstacles and create cruel experiences for us even. But it's better if someone can be supported by an elder and told that unfortunately there is a bad side of human nature, and sometimes the people who are you would think should be the most kind and supportive, because we're talking about the field of psychology here, the helping people in the helping profession, they're going to have their biases, and their biases are potentially harmful to you and to those that we serve in our profession. And on that note, Dr. Sen, that is a big reason why multiculturalism needs to continue to be made part of the developmental period, an ever evolving process of all of us that are licensed in the field of psychology in whatever way we are. That should be a destination we hope for, but that we're always trying to improve, because all of us are cultural beings, all of us are possible of biases. How do I know those people weren't even aware that they were doing that at the time? But it's not always safe to bring it up at the time. For instance, I may need to have a talk with someone down the line, whenever I'm safer to do so. And now, I'm not in that situation, so I'm safer. But
it was an unfortunate experience. And like you're saying, these systems are created. It's unnecessary. And I'm glad that there is a lot of social justice work happening right now that is acknowledging the realities of the systems we're in and inequities that are happening. And how do we acknowledge our biases and try to learn from it? And like you're saying, it's an ongoing journey. Well, Dr. Reyna, I really appreciate you being on this podcast and sharing your insight with us. Is there a way for listeners to reach you?
Sure. My general Google address is the best. It's rsreyna184@gmail.com.
All right. Well, I will definitely include that on the show notes along with the sculpture. We definitely want to see that. All right, Dr. Reyna, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you like what you've heard, please share and subscribe to our podcast, People of Color in Psychology.